Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's dialogue on development research. My name is George Marbuah. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. So before I introduce our speaker for today, I'll say a few words about SEI and SWEDEV. So this dialogue is a joint initiative taken by the Development and Aid Policy team at the Stockholm Environment Institute, headquarters here in Stockholm, and SWEDEV, that is the Swedish Development Research Network. The DAP team, or the Development and Aid Policy team at the SEI, is a new team that was formed in 2021 to put a spotlight on the development dimension or aspects of SEI's research portfolio. And so this dialogue series was birthed together with SWEDEV to sort of create a space to learn from researchers working on development issues within our own network, but also to enhance our network. And SWEDEV is an open member-based network that started in 2019. And so the aim of that network is to connect development researchers within Sweden, but also to connect or strengthen collaboration between researchers working in development issues and then policymakers. So basically, this dialogue series seeks to invite speakers from within Sweden and internationally, especially those from the Global South, to share findings on ongoing or finished work on development issues that has implication for development practice, basically. And with that said, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today. She's in the person of Anzetse Were. She is a senior economist at the financial sector deepening in Africa, FSD for short, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya. So Anzetse is a development economist with extensive experience in applied economic research, in advising and strategy in Africa. Her core areas of expertise span financial sector and finance systems in Africa, the digital economy and innovation, sustainable finance, women and work, and political economy of finance and development in general in Africa. She's a widely authored person with articles and reports in international media outlets, business magazines, and development periodicals, including the OECD Development Matters platform. So Anzetse will speak on a very important topic, financial architecture for a green and climate resilient Africa. So basically, the talk will highlight the fact that climate change has varied or heterogeneous impact across sectors and of course other people in different spaces across the continent, and the fact that the funding gap for closing or at least reducing the impact of climate change either through mitigation and or adaptation still persists and needs some innovation to sort of close that gap. And so basically the talk will explore the layered economic effect of climate change on the continent and how to recraft the financial architecture to enhance the positive impacts or effects of green and climate finance towards economic resilience in Africa. And to discuss this very important topic, we have Númi Östlund, who is a program manager at the Expert Group for Aid Studies, EBA, based here in Sweden. He is a development finance practitioner, an aid sector specialist, and a political scientist. So the structure of this talk will follow, will be as follows. So we will have 30 minutes for the presentation by Anzetse, and then there'll be about 15 minutes reflections from Númi. And then audience will have about 15 to 20 minutes to pose your questions, which you can do while the presentation is ongoing, and they'll be forwarded to Anzetse during the Q&A time. So with that said, I will hand over to Númi, who will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And I mean, you've already done the introduction, so I'll promptly hand over to Anzette. But I just want to thank SVEDEV and SEI for organizing this, as it is, I think, without exaggerating, an absolutely crucial topic. How will we ensure that our response to climate change, mitigation, adaptation, receives the resources needed where it's needed? And I'm thrilled that we have Anzette here today to help us kind of unpack the situation in Africa, both in terms of, I think, challenges and hopefully also potential opportunities. So it's with great pleasure I hand over to you, Anzette.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George and Númi, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on this. I'll just go ahead and share my screen so that we can get into it. First of all, just by background, I'll just let you guys know that what I'm talking about is active research praxis policy advising that I'm undertaking, both with African governments, but with also development partners and foreign governments. This is a live conversation that's happening. It's not something stuck in theory. So this is really what I'm going to look at. I'm not going to go through this one by one, but I just wanted to point you guys to the picture because if you've ever been to Africa and you've eaten any food in Africa, it's likely been farmed and raised by women who are the bulk of smallholder farmers who feed the African cities and villages and towns. So that's something that's often not acknowledged. So that's really what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at the effects and then go through the different types of impacts and then the way architecture can respond. So, I mean, first of all, climate change has lots of effects, but, as a development economist, I'm a macroeconomist by training, and then I have sectoral expertise. I'm really going to focus on the climate change effects that have the most pronounced economic impacts across all layers of the economy. And I think what's really important when you're looking at African economies beyond, looking at broad strokes of Africa and looking at regional things, I think what's really important is to look at the layered impacts and opportunities for intervention that exist. People just tend to get stuck on one layer, but you'll find that there are many layers to that. So these are just some of the impacts, and you can see from the map that Africa is number one on that. So I'll just sort of start with the macroeconomic impacts. I mean, first of all, if you look at already the impact that climate change is having on Africa, we are on the current trajectory set to lose about 3% of GDP by 2050. Africa has already lost more economic growth and output because of climate change than other regions. And what's the impact on that is if you combine the attrition effect that climate change is having, it has a material impact on GDP per capita, particularly if you're looking at the demographic dividend that's happening with the African youth population bulge. It's our turn to grow. So I don't know why people frame this as a crisis. Other regions have had their periods of population growth. It's now Africa's turn. It's not some crisis that needs to be managed. But what's happening is that it's happening as Africa is beginning to bear the brunt of climate change effects, having contributed almost nothing. Another layer on the macroeconomic effect. So just to step this back a bit and help you understand why I'm taking this approach. There's Africa and all economies have three main layers. There's a macroeconomic layer, then there's a meso layer, a sectoral layer. Well, you can divide the middle layer different ways. It can be sector or region, but I'll focus on sector. And then there's a microeconomic layer, which is households and firms. So if you're looking at the macroeconomic layer, the other thing that we're seeing, and I just wrote an article on this, is the direct impact climate change is having on fiscal space in Africa and fiscal policy options. I'll get into that a bit. And then also it's having at the macroeconomic layer pronounced effects on monetary policy, meaning the forms of pushing up inflation and eating up foreign exchange space, which then has a material impact on currency depreciation. So just at the macro there, that's what we're dealing with in Africa right now. So I'll just sort of go into the macro first. As I'd mentioned, the combined macroeconomic effects, could lower the continent's GDP by 3%. But what's really most, I think, troubling, apart from the loss and damage figures that you can see there and the reduced economic output, is that climate change is actually increasing economic inequality between temperate regions and Africa. So not only is Africa dealing with a historical economic injustice that has led to a weakened economic positioning, what we're finding now is that climate change is exacerbating that. So the richer countries will get richer, and a lot of the African countries that are struggling will continue to struggle because of the effects of climate change, of course, which we really didn't have anything to do with creating. So that, I think, is a real economic injustice at the micro layer that often isn't talked about. Now I'll just talk about fiscal, and I mean, I apologize if this slide is a bit much, but I assume I'm dealing with academicians and I could get quite technical. So if you look at fiscal policy, climate change is impacting all three arms of fiscal policy. The main impact I'll focus on revenues is impacts on agriculture. The agriculture sector represents about 25% of GDP and is a very important sector for African economic activity, firm activity, but also export activity. What has been happening in a region like Kenya, where we're just coming out of it's probably one of the worst droughts we've seen in 15 to 20 years. Some were saying it's the worst drought we've seen in 30 years. We're just coming out of that. And the effect of this prolonged drought period and also floods, the impact that it has on agriculture is that it lowers firm activity in the sector, which means that African governments cannot even generate domestic currency from firm activity in that sector. But more importantly, for a lot of regions that do export agricultural commodities, the climate change effects of drought and extreme weather events, because extreme weather events damage crops and livelihoods quite a bit as well, which is something that's often overlooked. And so what happens is that those export receipts don't materialize because those export commodities are not being produced and exported. What then that happens, what then that means for African economies is that there's less revenue to meet current expenditure, but also debt obligations. And it's also having an impact on our infrastructure, as you can see, in terms of hydropower revenues. African governments have put an immense amount of investment on improving their energy and transport infrastructure, including renewable energy sources such as hydropower. And what we're finding is that in the driest climate scenario, a lot of those investments just will not materialize the revenues that had been intended. So African governments have sunk in a massive capital, but because of climate change, those revenues just will not materialize. So on the expenditure side, you'll see already 2 to 9% of budgets are being hemorrhaged to unplanned allocations to deal with climate crises, whether that's droughts, cyclones, floods. You can see the estimates there from the IFC on flood-induced damage in Africa. And just to bear in mind, it's really important to note that 8 of the 20 countries, in terms of the country's GDP per capita due to climate change, 8 of the 20 countries with the highest expected annual damages in road and rail assets will be in Africa relative to the country's GDP. So just to bear in mind that the scale of investment that's been made in infrastructure is now being decimated by the impacts of climate change. Another often overlooked expenditure burden that Africa is bearing and African governments are bearing is in the health sector. What we're finding is that climate change effects are increasing the disease burden that African health systems are having to deal with and increasing the expenditure that African governments are having to allocate to deal with that. So this is increases in malaria-prone areas. This is to do with increases in diarrheal diseases because of floods, which damage water and sanitation systems and lead to quite difficult living conditions. This has to do with the extreme mental health issues that a lot of Africans are facing because of the trauma, depression, that comes with extreme weather events that are not almost happening on an annual basis. This is also to do with respiratory diseases because of dust storms, particularly in areas that are being affected by drought. So that the disease burden is going up, and that's just going to be a cost that African governments are going to have to deal with in addition to a growing population. Now, just sort of look at debt because it's a debt climate nexus that is beginning to get attention. And I think as we look at debt restructuring and relief, this is going to be centered and a part of a process that is centering this process, this approach. The main effect that climate change is having on debt is, first of all, if you look at the level of investment African governments have made in infrastructure, it's interfering with the multiplier effects of infrastructure. And I cannot overemphasize the impact that then has on macroeconomic growth. The second thing it really does is that it reduces the productive potential of that debt. So if you look at the type of debt that a government can get into, it can get into debt that needs to be current expenditure and that's not productive, or it can get into development-oriented debt that is meant to be productive. So the bulk of investments that were made in infrastructure over the past 20 years had a productive intention behind it. And if you look at the impact that climate change is having on the infrastructure that mainly was financed by public debt, you're beginning to understand the level of exposure African governments are finding themselves in, having accrued debt to build infrastructure that is now being decimated by climate change. And they're still liable for all that debt. As I mentioned, the revenue generation that climate change is having is pronounced. And this is both having an impact on local currency and USD foreign currency, which means that there's less funding available to meet internal and external debt obligations. And of course, as the obvious point, that rather than using expenditure to deal with what the government wants to deal with, more and more money is being directed to have to deal with the costs of climate change. So that's just on the fiscal impact. Just to bear in mind, I'm still at the macroeconomic there. The monetary policy impact is also pronounced. And the reason why this is important is because when you start interfering with monetary policy space, you really limit the levers that African governments have to manage things like inflation and forex depreciation. So one of the things that we're seeing, and this is a study that came out from the IMF, is that the damage to infrastructure caused by extreme weather events actually places upward pressure on transport inflation because of the impact it has on the transport infrastructure, and therefore the cost of transport in and out of the affected region goes up. And because climate change has a negative effect on food production, you find that the continent's imports of food are not going down in any way. In fact, they're increasing. The monetary policy impact that has is that in addition to importing food, African governments import the food inflation from the source countries. And furthermore, they're having to use foreign exchange, precious foreign exchange, to import food, which then weighs on their exchange rates. So the dual monetary policy impact is on inflation and currency depreciation due to forex erosion. So I'll just sort of leave this for now. I'm not going to belabor this. This is in an article that I think I can put in the chat later. But this is just to make the point that just at the macro level, there's a vicious cycle that climate change is really creating in African economies, where it damages crops and infrastructure, it leads to increased expenditure on food, it increases inflation, it erodes forex reserves, it then informs currency depreciation, and actually exacerbates inflation, which then leads to higher expenditure and lower forex reserves, which then means there's less fiscal and monetary space to deal with climate change. So then climate change just continues in this vicious cycle. So I think it's really important to bear in mind that these are effects already being born. This is not something that's going to happen in the future. So I'll sort of just shift and go to the sectoral impacts. I'm now in the middle there of the economy. And this is just an indicative, sense of the layered sectoral impacts that climate change is having. I'd already mentioned agriculture. The real problem we're having with the agriculture sector is not only is this such a big share of GDP at 25%, but 52 to 66% of Africans rely on that. So if you're looking at labor force participation, the impact that climate change is having on the agricultural sector is having a material effect on the livelihoods of most Africans. And that's a real problem because we already have productivity issues in the agriculture sector. Now climate change is exacerbating that. As a result, food insecurity is due to rise. And in our lifetime, we're going to lose about 16% of GDP due to malnutrition informed by climate change specifically. And that's an IMF figure. As we know, water is an issue in Africa. I don't need to belabor that point. The real struggle with the water really is the changing rainfall patterns are following a pattern where dry regions get drier and wet regions get wetter. And no matter what the extreme weather event, whether you're dealing with a drought, such as in the picture there, and people just spend days just looking for water, or you're dealing with a situation where there's a flood leads to proper water problems as well. It's not like just because you have a flood, suddenly there's abundance of water. What you deal with in flood conditions is massive amounts of contaminated water. So actual drinking water actually becomes an even bigger problem in a flood scenario. I just want to highlight the impact on tourism, because tourism in Africa has been one of the biggest growing sectors in Africa, and it has been an important sector for forex generation. And what we're finding is that because tourism in Africa is so natural asset dependent, the impacts of climate change actually directly lead to lower tourist arrivals, particularly in cases where there's extreme heat. What tends to happen, because wildlife tourism, as you see, there's a very important part of African tourism. Countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, this is almost the entire bouquet that we offer for tourism. So when you're dealing with an extreme heat situation, there's lower mobility of animals. Sometimes the animals even die. And so the reason why tourists want to go to your country in the first place just really isn't there. The other impact that climate change is having is altering wildlife migration. So even in Kenya now, it's sort of like unsure when the wildebeest migration will happen. Will it happen? Will it not happen? And certainly during a period of extreme drought like we're just coming out of, one of the biggest attractors of tourists, which is the wildebeest migration, actually doesn't really happen at all. So there's a direct impact that we're seeing in a very important forex generating sector in tourism. And as I said, in health, those are some of the impacts that we're seeing. So at a sectoral level, those are some of the impacts. I'm not going to get into aquaculture or forestry. These are other sectors that are materially impacted by climate change. Now I'm going to start looking at the microeconomic impacts. These are the impacts that climate change is having on households and firms. The first is involuntary displacement, in the case of floods, and even in case of droughts and extreme weather events, damage to homes and livelihoods. As you can see, in 2020 alone, 1.2 million Africans were displaced. But the business disruptions are often overlooked, where a lot of the African livelihoods that rely on micro, small, and medium enterprises that have low levels of resilience to massive shocks are materially disrupted during extreme weather events, whether that's an extreme drought or a cyclone or a flood, and therefore this has an effect of deepening poverty. Another factor that is informed by climate change is conflict. I think the Economist overstated this, and I really dislike sensationalist articles on Africa, and that was a good example of how not to report this. But the impact that climate change is having on conflict is there, and it is present, but it does depend on the region, and it does depend on contextual factors within that region. So the way you can think about the impact that climate change is having on conflict is that it is exacerbating already fragile communities with an additional burden on competition of resources, which then can really fire up into conflict in specific areas. I wouldn't overstate that, because conflict is a multivariate issue, but climate change is just an additional factor that's making situations worse in some regions. So I think in terms of households, I just want to emphasize that because climate change is having these layered impacts, food insecurity is becoming more of an issue. Inflation is beginning to hit households quite seriously in the food basket. And you have to bear in mind that for low-income households, most of their income, about 60% of their income, is used on food anyway. So when you combine the effect of heightened food insecurity with the fact that now food is more expensive because of climate change, I think you're beginning to understand the strain that households are dealing with. And on the expenditure side, in terms of on the income side, you'll find that a lot of the low-income households are reliant on sectors that are exposed to climate change, particularly agriculture. And climate change is essentially eating up into their opportunity to generate revenue in a steady manner. So they're being hit both on the expenditure side and on the income side. So the livelihood and firm level strain is something that I think needs to be looked at a bit more seriously, and hopefully will be going forward. So I'll just sort of leave this for now, and just look at this, tell you what I've been walking you through. I've walked you through all of this, okay? So it starts at the household level, there are sectoral impacts, there are impacts on fiscal and monetary policy, and then there are aggregated impacts on economic welfare that I've walked you through. So I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm going to break this down a bit more in an article that's coming up with British International Investment. So when that's available, I'll share it with George and team. So I just want to share that, there's a triple injustice that I think African governments and people are dealing with now. First is we're already shouldering the impacts of climate change. The only region that is more vulnerable to climate change than Africa is certain developing economies in Southeast Asia. Second, we're already bearing the fiscal and monetary policy effects of climate change, and this limits the ability of African governments to deal with the crisis. But the real injustice that we need to manage and we need to make sure it does not materialize is that because of the impact that climate change is having on fiscal and monetary policy, and because of the impact that climate change is having on debt sustainability, the reality is that the combined effect of external shocks, internal issues, and climate change is creating a lot of distress in African governments. And the concern that I've seen with a lot of African governments is that there's no environment where there's an intellectual openness and a sense of an environment of fairness where African governments can be honest about the impacts that climate change is having on their economies without being penalized by the market, where the African risk premium goes even up and African governments are shut out of international financial markets even further because of this. This is a real injustice that we're dealing with in lifetime right now. So I think I'll just sort of walk through some of the reforms that I've been working on and some that I think I'm happy to report actually being taken quite seriously by different players. First, it's just the point I'm making is to create a fairer environment in the global financial system where African governments can be honest about the impact that climate change is having on the effects, these varied effects, without being penalized by the market. Because this is something that obviously they didn't cause and that will mature over time. We're not even at the beginning of the effects here. So that's a really important push that I'm a part of, and that I would encourage others who care about Africa to be a part of, particularly now as we're going through a prolonged, probably a 2 to 3 year period of debt restructuring. The second is to foster fiscal resilience to climate change. African governments are not doing a good job, and even multilateral institutions are not doing a good job at assessing the scale of impact that climate change is having on fiscal space and fiscal policy. So this is the time to start creating very specific measures to assess the scale of the impact that climate change is having on fiscal policy, and of course, taking remedial action. One way to do that is to integrate a climate lens into the debt sustainability analysis. Going forward, there needs to be a default climate lens into all the sustainability analysis in all economies, including Africa, so that there's a bit more of a sober understanding on the type of debt servicing that most African and other governments can actually deal with. And frankly, the provision of concessionary and low-cost financing to mitigate the impacts of climate change. I think another big important fact is to assess the climate resilience of key investments made by public debt. So as you know, most African governments have been prioritizing plugging their infrastructure deficit over the past 20 years. There's been a massive spend. Sorry, if you're seeing my dog, he's sorry about that. So one of the things that we're seeing is that because of the massive impacts that investments that African governments have made in energy and transport infrastructure in particular, it's important now that we go back and assess whether those are climate smart investments, whether those were climate resilient investments, and take remedial action to make sure that those investments are made climate smart and climate resilience where possible, so that we can start dealing with mitigating the effect of this public debt overhang on investments made that are now being hit by climate change. I can't overemphasize that is a very important debt management tool that African governments, should start getting into. I think on the monetary policy side, I think getting again a clear appreciation on the scale of the impact climate change is having on upward pressure on inflation, forex depreciation, erosion of forex reserves. This is a really important thing to look at, particularly now, given the scale of debt service obligations and local and foreign currency that is going to be maturing between now and about 2026. It's important to get a scale of the impact climate change is having there, so that there's some sobriety in terms of the options that are available to deal with these monetary policy effects. And I think just finally at the macroeconomic layer and the architecture at the macro layer is to really integrate an African climate priorities into debt relief and restructuring. There's a real openness to this. I think we've been in conversations with different governments, and there is a real appetite to ensure that whatever conversations we have on relief and restructuring, we are centering green growth, green resilience, climate resilience as a way of moving forward macroeconomically. The sectoral interventions, I'm not going to get into this green recovery bond because I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just sort of highlight what's on the left. First of all, is to prioritize all infrastructure investment into Africa now going forward should be by default climate smart and climate resilience. We do not have the money or the luxury anymore to be spending massive amounts on infrastructure and it not being climate resilient. So this needs to be the way infrastructure is built, and not just transport and energy infrastructure, but buildings, affordable housing, this new wave of infrastructure financing that's coming into Africa, renewable energy, because renewable energy also needs to be climate smart, okay? Just because you're doing a renewable energy project, it doesn't mean it's resilient to floods or droughts. So you've got to apply that lens all the way through. I think you've got to look at priority sector assessment and interventions. What African governments really need to do is assess their sectoral exposure to climate change in terms of GDP and their labor force participation exposure to climate change. When you get those two figures, you'll begin to understand what steps you need to take to buffer GDP growth from climate change, but also to buffer livelihoods from climate change. So you need to do both. I think building green project pipelines to secure sector resilience. I'm going to go into this a bit later, so I won't belabor that now. And green recovery bonds is something that I've been actively working on and building in the debt relief for green and inclusive recovery project. I'm a co-chair of that alongside other individuals, such as the Ulrich Waltz and Kevin Gallagher. I don't know if you know them. And one of the things we're trying to look at is how can some of the old debt that is causing debt strain be swapped out for a green recovery bond through the structure that you're seeing there. I won't get into that. If there are questions on that, I can maybe deal with that later. So I'll just sort of look through the architecture for green and climate flow. This is a hyper-simplified version, and I won't get into a lot of detail in this. Again, you can read this in the article that I've linked beyond there. My main point here is that the main way we're going to get sector resilient to climate change is by building green project pipelines in those priority sectors. The approach right now that climate investors and financiers have on investment, private sector or even multilateral or DFI investment into sectors that they're interested in, it tends to be focused on deals rather than this architecture that I'm outlining. So there's a real opportunity for climate investors and development players that are interested in deepening project pipelines in key sectors in Africa to focus on the architecture from the origination of projects to preparing them. And I cannot explain to you how expensive it is to prepare projects. If you look at the green bond that was issued in Kenya, one of the only countries, I think there are only 3 or 4 countries in Africa that have issued green bonds. This was a private sector green bond. This wasn't a sovereign green bond. The amount of money that was just spent on project preparation, I cannot explain that that's a major bottleneck to scaling green project pipeline development. There needs to be a focus on the financing itself, finding the right green financial vehicles. I think we're getting stuck in a bit of a way of doing things and financing green deals. And I think we need to start looking at how do we actually do better matching. And then obviously another big cost that a lot of firms and even governments deal with is reporting, disclosure, and compliance costs. And this is even up to corporate companies. Yeah, corporate companies will tell you, we do not have budget lines to spend money reporting against all these many different types of standards and frameworks that we have to comply with. So these things are a material bottleneck, and focusing on this architecture can create a real common good of a deeper green and climate deal flow. And I'll just close sort of with services to support households and firms, because the household and firm issues often something people don't want to deal with, but it's really where most of the pressure is felt in terms of livelihoods and hunger and malnutrition. First is getting better climate data, and one of the things I see in Africa is that, and this is by everybody, not just African governments, but even external partners, there's an intellectual appreciation for the need for data, but people do not usually want to put money down to consistently collect the data over time. As a result, what you get in Africa across different sectors, whether it's climate change or whatever you're looking at, you tend to get very patchy data and snapshots in time using different methodology that just ends up being useless in terms of comparability point of view. It's really important that we get consistent methodology across time that builds climate data so that we can begin to understand which regions and which households are really being hit by climate change. Climate responsive services are also very key. There needs to be cash transfer and direct support to households that are very vulnerable to climate change. and there's an opportunity to build those climate vulnerability profiles. And finally, to get African governments with development partners to get more intelligent about climate disaster relief services. So I think with that, I'm just going to end. And I will hand over back to you, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Anzette, for this really interesting presentation. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm happy. I've got a first shot at posting a few questions and coming with a number of reflections. But I also encourage the audience to use the Q&A function to contribute with your thoughts and questions as well, and I'll try to pick them up a bit later on. Yeah, and as I said, there's so much to unpack here, both in the terms of understanding and underlining this kind of grim view of the layered climate effects that you so well describe in the African context, but also, and I think I'll focus on that a bit on the potential solutions and dig into that a bit. But if I may, I start with a personal reflection. I before my current position at the expert group, I worked a stint with green bonds and also with a bit with green bonds in Africa, and I was in Nairobi in 2019, just after the issuing of this, I think the first Kenyan green bond, the Acorn bond, and there was a lot of excitement. There was the focus on this being the first step of a green bond market in Kenya, and the first step of green bond markets in Africa, with South Africa, of course, being an exception with that, where we had a few issuance already, and that being kind of the green bond market being also the front runner in establishing kind of green finance markets and having more green finance solutions in the African context. Now 4 years on, we're not really seeing it, and I think it's well, it's disheartening, of course, hearing your description of where we are now, and with that, the excitement we saw, say 4 years ago or 4 or 5 years ago, and also, I'll come back to that, but I think really interesting pinpoint kind of the solutions were also kind of the bottlenecks already discussed then, and the key one is kind of there was a lot of work, for example, in the Green Bonds program in Kenya on trying to identify project pipelines, identifying projects. And I think what I think is very interesting with your analysis that you haven't really touched upon yet, but I know you've written extensively on, is kind of the mismatch between the available climate finance and the type of potential projects available in the African context. And I think that will be, I'll have a number of questions on that for sure. But another thing I also find really interesting when I hear your presentation and this kind of unpacking this layered, as you say, layered the layered effects on Africa from climate change, is still the kind of a lack of acceptance of these risks. And when I remember, as an anecdote, but I remember in a conference in Nairobi where it's a meeting with regional bankers, and there was a presentation of this green bond, the new green bond, and the potential with these climate bonds, for example, and representatives from these regional banks say, well, this is super interesting, but we don't really, we don't even have a bond market, so why should we look at the green bond market? And we're not really exposed to climate risks. And then it was actually, I think maybe one of your colleagues from FSD Africa said, well, you're not exposed to climate risk. How much, I mean, hands raised in this room, how many of you have a significant part of your portfolio in agriculture? And then he went on and highlighting the points that you just made on the the risks of higher temperatures, more severe storms, drought, and so on. And you saw that you saw everyone coming to this realization, and that this is still something that needs to be underlined. Is also chilling in a way, that we see not really this progress that we wanted on the financial side, but not even perhaps on the acceptance side. So that's that was sobering to hear this presentation, and if I may, with some questions as well, not only reflections. And I'd really like to just start by, if possible, unpacking this kind of on the I guess on the meso level or sector level, or this, but this mismatch, this key bottleneck in kind of the misalignment between the style of supply and the supply of finance and the potential projects. And perhaps you could, for those who haven't read your writing on that, say a few words on this mismatch, but also where you see this, how we can solve this problem, and if possible.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And just to say before I answer that, one of the reasons why you're seeing a reluctance in acknowledging the climate risk is because Africa already pays a massive risk premium. Yeah. Africa already has a risk perception problem. And often if you look at the methodology or the logic reasoning behind why Africa is graded down and other countries aren't graded down is often unclear as to why that decision was made. So there's a hypersensitivity in the continent to adding another thing that then the global financial market can use to say, oh, let's even push up the African risk premium even more. So this is one of the problems with the injustice in the global financial architecture that I was alluding to, is that this predisposition to unfairly burden Africa with risk perceptions that sit in the minds of European and North American investors who have a very poor understanding of the continent, and frankly, could do a lot more to improve their understanding of their continent. So they could understand what risks you can manage, what you can't manage. This is a massive macroeconomic injustice that African governments continue to navigate in the global financial architecture. This is why you see this reluctance in admitting the seriousness of climate risk. I'm of the view that we need to be very open about it, and that we need to start being quite clear that that risk is not one that we created, and we therefore should not be penalized for it. But that's why you're going to continue seeing that. So on the architecture point, I mean, basically what seems to be happening on the green bond point, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was part of the sister organization that I work with was part of putting that together. The reason why you have not seen a lot of momentum on green and sustainability bonds in Africa is because unless you actually have a dedicated work stream that is focused on originating projects and preparing them, climate and green investors will not touch those projects. What we're seeing in the Europe and North American markets is a wave of almost hysteria around green and climate finance. But you're also seeing the regulators having a very low tolerance for greenwashing and the misbehavior where companies claim things that they didn't. So what's happening is that climate financiers are understanding that they've got to be a lot more clear on their line to impact and be able to prove that. Secondly, what's happening on the supply side is that climate financiers, because of the reporting and disclosure requirements in climate finance, the level of rigor that you've got to apply to the projects that you want to finance are far higher than some normal project. So when you're saying that this is a green and climate investment that you're making, there is a list of compliance requirements that you are therefore saying that I am meeting these compliance requirements. As a result, when you now look at the demand side in the African economies, which are built on micro, small, and medium enterprises defined by informal activity, defined by a lack of data, this style of a very structured approach has a very difficult time interfacing with the reality of how African economies actually function. I have to say this is something we see a lot more in European and North American investors. And it doesn't just apply to climate, but it applies to traditional investments. We're seeing a bit more of an intellectual resilience or fortitude to deal with informality from investors from the global south, whether that's India, Brazil, China. They have a different intellectual approach. So I think there's a lot that European and North American investors could learn from that. But that's really the fundamental mismatch, the rigor and expectations of formal climate finance interfacing with a highly informal market. And that's why it's really important. And it is something that's been happening in some markets. Obviously, Kenya tends to be a bit further ahead on green stuff, but there is efforts, and I'm part of a process that's doing this, where you actually originate the projects, you vet them, and you start the process of preparation using development finance and grant capital. That's the only way you're going to get that preparation done. So even in the inaugural green bond that was done, the project preparation, which was, I can't even tell you how much it is because I'm probably not allowed to. It was insane, but all of it was grant finance. And that's the only reason you got that bond done. And that's why other bonds haven't been taken to market, because from an issuer's perspective, why would they go through all of that? They're already, going to have to comply to all these ridiculous reporting and disclosure standards. Why should they then spend even more money just trying to get the money in the first place? That will not be cheaper. There's this myth that green money is cheaper in Africa. It's not, it's more expensive, right? So that's really the problem that we're seeing in the green bond market. There's no incentive for issuers to issue green bonds. They'd rather just do a normal bond or just go to a bank and get the money and not deal with all this other nonsense. So that's part of that architecture problem that we're seeing. As a result, there's probably an understatement of green projects happening on the continent because people just don't want to deal with that headache, really, from an issuer's perspective.
Thank you. I mean, it's so interesting. I just want to unpack this and basically, first of all, touch back on your initial comments around the kind of the risk perception, as you call it, when it comes to kind of the understanding the African context from an international investor's perspective. And I think that's very interesting. I mean, there is already, as you say, there is already very much not actual risk, but investments are hindered by the risk perception. But I wonder if it's really better than that underplaying the climate risk rather than putting it on the table, as you say, because my understanding, or I mean, my perspective and experience is that it's better to have, a clear understanding of the risks than uncertainty about the risks, because uncertainty isn't you're not able to price that, but a risk you can price. So it makes sense to actually be a lot clearer about, this is the climate exposure to my investment. Let's price that in.
I completely agree with you. I mean, you are speaking to the converted. The problem that we have is there's honestly often an intellectual laziness when it comes to Africa. So there's this laziness of Africa, and I'll just say this is mainly from Europe and North American investors. We're seeing global South investors have a very different approach in terms of how they bring in FDI, and you're finding them beginning to overtake European and North American investors in terms of FDI. And actually, global South countries may be a better match for Africa for FDI than Europe and North America, if I'm perfectly honest with you. So there's this intellectual laziness of Africa runs a certain way, oh, it's corrupt, it's poor, and all this. Okay, so that's one of the problems, this legacy intellectual style, which is very difficult to break. And I don't know, that's not my problem to solve, but that's going to be an intellectual style that will make a lot of European and North American investors lose out on investment opportunities in Africa. So there's a real opportunity to update that. I think on the other thing that I think is a challenge is that African governments and the private sector facilitators are not good at helping interested investors learn how to navigate and manage risk in Africa. Okay, I think because a lot of people are so busy just trying to get the deal done, what is not happening is an opportunity to frankly coach, particularly greenfield investors who are very, because you've seen this new wave of like fintech investors who know almost nothing about the continent and live in PowerPoint land, and like Africa exists in PowerPoint land for them. But what is missing is a lot of African expertise that exists is not interfacing with this appetite that we see in green and climate investment to get sober risk mitigation and management tools on how you actually just manage the risk going forward. Because our economies are growing. So if you're looking at our markets, our GDP per capita is increasing, even with climate change, it is increasing. And our population is increasing. So our market is increasing over time. And that market is going to be one of the markets, it's good to get in early because of how young it is. But that's really where I think the match, there's an opportunity for better matching there to deal with this risk perception issue. Because as long as there's that level of ignorance on the way different economies work, and just to be clear, Kenyan economy is different from South African, is different from Niger and Congo, but you need to have people who understand how those economies work, and investors need to really start digging into the African expertise rather than just relying on people flying in and out. It's still something that happens a lot, where investors rely on people coming to New York to make the presentation, or Stockholm or London, rather than having a cadre of African experts that can say, no, that's not how that works. If you want to make this investment, do it like this. These people exist on the continent. So that's why I think a lot of the partnership can happen. And then the risk perception premium, that's one way to drive it down. But the big homework will be on just this legacy intellectual view that I think a lot of European and North American investors just tend to have when they deal with Africa.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I saw a really interesting, just to illustrate this kind of lack of understanding. I saw really interesting data the other day where basically they had looked at the investment cost of making basically the same solar park in different countries around the globe, and just seeing, okay, what would investors need to contribute to that investment. So it's basically it's the same project. So the project risk is the same, and then where do you see the expected return of investment, or the required one to be involved in that investment, and then they had Germany, of course, as kind of the baseline or bottom line, rather, really, and then seeing that the investor perception of that risk, because then it's not the project risk, it's not, it's the same exact product, probably, from just ordered from China, and developing countries in Africa, required 8 times more return on investment for it to be interesting. And then of course that's if there is a project in well, anywhere else, that's going to be more interesting to investors. But and another thing, just
I just want to add to that.
yeah,
I
please,
just want to add to
yes.
that risk is not managed because you need different types of skill set to manage different risks. This is what people don't understand in Africa. Okay, so when you're dealing with an investment risk, you need a certain type of skill set to manage that. But if you're going to be doing large projects that attract government attention, you need people who know how to manage political economy risk. Yeah. So what happens is that when an investor comes into Africa, because they don't have the cadre of people who have these skill sets, they'll focus on one type of risk and build out the risk management profile for that. But it's like if you're doing investments in sectors that have high political economy attention, yeah. So this is any infrastructure project, any big development in an urban area, anything to do with manufacturing, any fossil fuel investment, right? These heavy political economy investments, you must have the political economy risk guys in your team, period. So you can't just look at it from one lens of risk management. And I think that's really been where the downfall for a lot of, and especially in transport infrastructure, that we've seen this appetite in the US. But it's like when you come to the ground, you need to have people who help you manage the political economy risk so that you don't get drawn in this crazy world of politics that tends to interfere with these massive, particularly infrastructure projects. As I said, there are certain countries that are much better at dealing with that, and they've been able to make traction a lot faster. So just to bear in mind, just to add to your point, there are different types of risk with skill sets that you need, and you just need to be intelligent in how you put together the team, and then you'll be able to move forward quite easily.
Thank you. If I'll divert the question a bit, or questions a bit to closely related though. It's we're trying to understand where can we build these pipelines, where can we find these and aggregate these projects, and you said it's finding these kind of green project pipelines in priority sectors. Which would those be in your mind? I think that's very interesting, and also perhaps if you can reflect a bit on would those be, because of course there's the kind of the economic sectors, but there's also understanding in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and I think more importantly loss and damage due to climate change. So where would you find those, and what would you prioritize that building? Because I mean the picture painting is it's going to be resource intensive to build these pipelines.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the country and the composition of GDP and where the sectors are growing, and it depends on the investor. So if you're looking at a market investor that wants a return, you should look at sectors that are driving GDP growth and that have low emissions and that are already climate friendly. So ICT, financial services sector, real estate, yep. So it's possible to build out a portfolio just based on drivers of growth. That's something that a lot of investors do in market size, right? So you look at what's driving the economy, what's the latent and potential market in that. So that's the approach that, for example, the consortium that invested in Ethiopia did when they're investing, including Safaricom, when they're investing in the first mobile money wallet in Ethiopia. So that's one approach. If you're more of an impact investor, you sort of have to look at, well, do you want to go to high growth sectors that are large emitters like transport and construction, which are big drivers for growth. Transport and logistics is a big driver of growth for many African economies. Construction is as well. Obviously, manufacturing in countries like South Africa. And you sort of look at, well, we want to tap into the growth in these sectors, but we want to make sure we mitigate the effects of climate change. So that's another way to look at it. So if you're sort of a more market-oriented climate investor, that's sort of a way you can approach sector intervention. Now, if you're just like a development partner or player that's really just focused on impact, we sort of then have to look at, let's look at the sectors that are most important for African livelihoods and that are most affected by climate change. So that would be water, agriculture, these very difficult sectors that nobody wants to touch, understandably. But that's really where a lot of the patient capital and really quite mature investors, that's really a space for more mature investors that understand how to deal and actually care about the green and climate returns. So it depends on the country, and then it depends on the risk appetite and the investment style of the investor in question.
Thank you. And I'll bring in a few questions from the audience, and I think your last comment here is a good segue for one of them. We have Erik Wallin asking a bit on, I mean, the kind of the solutions you're putting on the table with the architecture and the approach to originating and aggregating projects, for example. I mean, there's different country contexts, obviously, and perhaps Kenya is much more mature. South Africa, I mean, you pointed to a number of sectors and countries, but so how do you see, for example, countries like Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and so on in these?
Yeah. I mean, it depends. On Somalia, that's a fragile country, but it is beginning to stabilize and open up, and there are investors that are interested in Somalia. You've got to be built for these environments, right? So you just have to bear in mind that not all the economies are for all investors, and that has to do with risk appetite. In the Congo, what you're going to be seeing is investors, a deeper pivot to rare earth minerals because of the interface between rare earth minerals and digital and renewable technology. So you're going to see a shift in the Congo, and it's happening now between investors that were doing fossil fuel investments into rare earth mineral investments. And there, again, you will need to have a skill set that is able to deal with the political economy of rare earth minerals, which is a great power competition issue. So the competition that you're seeing in countries like the DRC is a competition between particularly the US and China to try and get as many rare earth minerals as they can to then drive their renewable and digital technologies. However, what you're going to see from the African side, so just an opportunity for more enlightened investors, is a deeper demand of value addition on continent. This is something you're seeing in the DRC. This is something you're seeing in Zimbabwe. You're going to be seeing this more and more and more. There's a real exhaustion with Africans sitting at the bottom of the global value chain. And so what you're going to see, particularly in countries that have natural resources abundance in the rare earth minerals, will be a demand for value addition. And also investors in that space will be in the milieu of great power competition that's happening there. So it's absolutely right. Different countries will have different assets that you can tap into, different skill sets. And that's why I keep on saying there's a need to view African experts as African experts and not some local person that you talk to when you come in the country. These are the people who actually have the skills and the expertise to make sure you make the right investment decisions. So again, this is a bit more of an intellectual style problem of Europe and North American investors. It's like, oh, we'll just talk to some Africans and then make the decisions when you get back home. That then, don't blame Africa, right? Because then there are people on the continent who could have actually helped you mitigate and structure it properly to begin with. But yes, It depends on the country, absolutely.
And that allows me to bring in another question from the audience. Francis Johnson is asking about basically what you're saying now, that kind of American and European investors don't really have this understanding of the different contexts and different markets, different countries, and then puts a high risk premium on the investments, basically barring them from entering the market. But would you see them? I mean, you're pointing to the expertise of African experts, but is there an opportunity to bring in more investors from the global south that perhaps have a better understanding of the overall risk picture,
Absolutely.
market
That's
picture?
what's happening. I mean, China is overtaken. Is number one FDI investor in Africa for between 2005 and 2020. I wrote an article on this. You're going to be seeing Brazil, India, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Turkey is another big player that's coming in. And it's just, I really don't see any need to belabor this because the proof is in the pudding. At the end of the day, nobody can convince you to invest in a continent. If you don't have the risk appetite to deal with a country, that is your right. You don't have to be in that country. But that doesn't mean that other investors won't come in and take market share. So a good example is how Chinese private sector investors have taken over the African smartphone market. 75% of smartphones in Africa come from Chinese companies. That's because they actually have a very different intellectual approach to how they view Africa. When they see Africa as a market, period, a lot of foreign investors see Africa as a periphery market to products they're already making. So they'll make a phone or a product and say, let's see if we can sell some of this to Africa. That tends to be the approach. Whereas Chinese investors are making products for the African market. They are integrating the perspectives of African consumers into the markets. Therefore, market share is gained. And as the market grows, your market share just sort of grows with it. So that's one thing, is actually taking the African market seriously rather than taking it as something you kind of do on the side and then you kind of try and sell your products on the side. But the big one is their intellectual approach. They have a much more resilient attitude to informality. Part of it is because a lot of their economies are informal and there's a lot of economic proximity. You know, China was not where Africa was, where China was, 20, 30 years ago. So there's that intellectual proximity. But most importantly, their risk management tools are completely different. They have a completely different set of risk management tools that allow them to go and gain market access. Now, people say, oh, they don't care about the environment or labor. And I'm like, well, yes and no. It depends on the investor that you're dealing with. First of all, the environment problem that African countries have been dealing with started with European and North American firms. Yeah. To this day, the cocoa value chain that uses child labor is dominated by Western firms. So this is not something that is unique to China. This is just a way people have with dealing with Africa that I think is very, very problematic. But I think, again, I said it may be generational. I hope that maybe as Europe and North American players begin to understand that it's a multipolar world and that different parts of the world are getting richer and that African private sector and governments have different pools of money that they can tap into. This is on the private sector side, okay? I'm not talking about the government side, although it's also on the government side. That may then change an updating of how they view Africa, maybe taking African markets more seriously rather than seeing Africa as a charity case or a basket case. Because, as I said, those opportunities are being taken by other investors from other parts of the world that view Africa a bit differently.
And I mean, that in itself is not a problem. I mean, the key problem that where we started is the lack of finance and investment in the African market. So I mean, we're happy to see as much investments as possible, but we want to see a lot more for sure. And I just want to touch upon kind of 2 points and perhaps connect them. I mean, you talked previously about the kind of the lack of data in a lot of African markets, and you touched now on kind of the large sectors, the informal sector in a lot of African markets, and you've written also extensively on the fact that I mean, most of African markets are it's basically SMEs contributing to a large share of markets. So it means that there are very small potential investment tickets there with the informal market and the SMEs. And I think it's and then where you have SMEs, you have a lack of historical financial data in the sense where traditional European or American investors would like to say, okay, we can invest in this. Where's the data to invest in it? Where you've potentially been there and doing business for 20, 30 years, but you don't have the financial track record that Western investors are used to. And I know there's an interesting initiative, the Middle Eastern Investment Initiative, working with Northern Africa and MENA region, that basically have guarantees from the US, from Sweden, to aggregate SME finance, just because they know the market. So it's basically saying, well, we know the markets, we know the SMEs, they don't have the track record, but they've been here forever. So we, with a guarantee, we can start providing finance to them. Is that a potential solution to scale up in other markets as well?
The data thing, you're right. The guarantee, Africa, we have guarantees through our noses. Okay. The problem is that when you look at the way guarantees are deployed is the issue. Okay. So a lot of guarantees that come from DFIs, multilaterals, more concessional financing, understandably tend to deploy that through the banking sector. The problem that we deal with the banking sector is that a lot of SMEs don't go to banks for their financing. Okay. So there is a mismatch between this attempt to use guarantees to scale finance into SMEs. Whereas look at where SMEs actually get their money from and try and figure out how do we enlarge and deepen that pool. So I'll just say two things. One, technology is playing a very important role. AI and generative AI will be increasingly important in the allocation of small ticket sizes to large amounts of small firms. This is something where obviously Kenya is leading quite a bit, given the maturity of the mobile money market here. And so it's really important that the AI models that are used to determine ticket sizes for those small ticket SME firms is really fair. Number one. The real big problem we're seeing with SME financing is scale. What SMEs want is small amounts of money over a long period of time. So they want a large amount, but not immediately. They often want small amounts consistently over time. And the big thing they really want is flexibility in repayment. Formal financial sector are really bad at that. They just do not understand how to do that. And that's really one of the areas where we're seeing, if we're talking about now growth markets, if you can figure out how to give small ticket sizes to SMEs consistently over time and be flexible in where you get it back, where you say we will expect payment twice a year, okay, you will now begin to see SMEs getting a bit interested. Because if you look at the way the banking sector, they're like, we don't want this nonsense of expensive credit and then you come every month harassing me. We don't want that. That doesn't help my life. What I want is this amount over time. I want maybe 20 million, let's say I want $300,000 over 1.5 years, and I want to be able to draw down on it as I need it. And then I pay you back like once or twice a year, and you need to be comfortable with that. Now that's what we're now working on, is how do you use tech and AI to do that fairly? Now there's an inherent bias with AI that I know you're all aware of. And that now comes to the data question, which I said before. Everybody wants the data, nobody wants to build the infrastructure. And I have live experience that it will take you 10 years, okay, of proving that data is useful before governments and others are say, okay, we'll put budget lines to this. Because if you look at the constellation of things people want to spend money on, everybody wants the data, but when push comes to shove, do you want to put money on a data budget line or some health expenditure budget line? So that's really the disconnect I see on the data question. And it would be really useful. And I am seeing some appetite now because people are beginning to understand that really we've got to be more intelligent about this. But we'll see. The proof will be in the pudding as to whether people actually start putting their money down on building the data ecosystems that are required. If not, AI will do it for us. So
AI will do it for us. That's that might be some positive ending words for this. I'm going to hand over to George. Thank you very much for this very exciting and interesting conversation. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Númi, and thank you, Anzette, for this very, very interesting presentation on a very relevant topic that still needs unpacking. And we are ready and available, with this platform for future discourses, around some of these very complex topics. But this platform is available to contribute to understanding some of these complex issues, and we will be very happy to have you another time when you have something to share with the development community. Both academics and practitioners are I think willing to listen to some of these issues. So with that said, my final comment is that this issue is really important and has come at the right time, as we seek to scale green finance and other sources of finance to solve the climate crisis and other development needs across the continent. The fact that the solutions are quite multi-layered and the understanding of the whole architecture is quite complex, but needs to be done or started in some shape or form is really, really important. We look forward to the findings of the second aspect of the research that you are doing about the real solutions. We will be very happy to share that within our network, SWEDEV network, and also within the DAP team. And so please, you are welcome to come to us again. We'll be extending an invitation to you in the future, and we'll be keeping an eye on most of the things that you are doing, and we'll be very happy that you refer some other colleagues of yours and within your network to us. They are welcome to present their research also on this platform. So with that being said, so thank you, Anzetse, thank you, Númi, for a very incisive discussion and reflections, and thanks to the audience for those comments and questions. I will end this by giving a few, I'll say, updates on some upcoming events. So number one, please, if you want to receive invitations from us for other events that will be coming up, sign up to the SWEDEV newsletter on our webpage, swedev.dev. Also come to us with comments and ideas, or even speakers, potential speakers that you think we should invite for forthcoming events. Our platform is young but growing steadily, and it is sort of gaining the traction that I think it deserves. So I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker in this dialogue series, but this will happen after the summer in September. And that will be Professor Tony Addison, a very well-known economist who is based at the University of Copenhagen and also affiliated with the UN-UWIDA in Finland. And he was going to speak on the topic, the extractive industries in the developing world, dilemmas and opportunities. I think this might be interesting to some of you. Please sign up when we send out the invitation. And also, SWEDEV has this upcoming conference, the 7th Nordic Development Research Conference, that will take place in Uppsala. Please, you are treated to sign up and register, even if you are not a presenter or leading a workshop or a session, registration has closed for that, but registration is still open for people who want to attend and listen to some of the discussions there until July. You can register from now until July to be at this NORDEV conference 2023 in Uppsala, which will happen on the 23rd of August until at the 21st to the 23rd of August. So without this said, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and hope to see you another time when we have another dialogue series. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.